Hi, everyone. I'm Beverly Bond, founder of Black Girls Rock, and we're excited to bring you another episode of the BGR Book Club in partnership with Microsoft. The BGR Book Club is designed to build and promote community empowerment and literacy and leadership. And each month we select an inspirational, thought-provoking book for the BGR community to read and discuss. And today, our featured Women's History Month author is Ibi Zoboi, who will be discussing her book, Star Child, a biographical, sorry, a biographical constellation of Octavia Estelle Butler. Star Child illuminates the young life of visionary storyteller Octavia Butler, whose groundbreaking science fiction novels continue to challenge and delight readers. Ibi holds an MFA in writing from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Her young adult novel, American Street, was a National Book Award finalist, and her debut middle school novel, My Life as an Ice Cream Sandwich, was a New York Times bestseller. Her most recent bestseller, Punching the Air, is a young adult novel in verse co-authored by prison reform activist Yusuf Salaam of the Exonerated Five. Ibi will be interviewed by our very own BGR alum, Melaine Ferdinand-King, who received her BA with honors from Spelling College, where she majored in sociology with a concentration in the African diaspora in the world and women gender studies. As a PhD candidate in Africana Studies at Brown University, Melaine researches or her research explores the relationship between 20th century Afro-diasporic cultural production and Black political expression and political action in the 21st century. Melaine has earned a Mellon Fellowship in Collaborative Humanities, and she also serves as a graduate fellow of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and she's the 2021 and 2022 president of the Black Graduate Student Association at Brown University. And she's been a BGR alum since 2012. Welcome, Ibi and Melaine.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I'm very honored to have been selected as the March Book Club Ambassador for Black Girls Rock. It is an honor to be here with Ibi today to talk about Star Child. It was a pleasure to read, and I really admired the combination of verse and prose that was integrated into the book. And as a fan and a writer of poetry, I think the gentle narrative of the story is something that children could really lean into. And I think it tells the story of Octavia Butler in a phenomenal way. I'd like to begin this discussion by just reading the titular poem, Star Child, that is on the back cover of the book. I think that it really is a testament to the legacy of Octavia Butler, and it gives us a bit of a sense of what we are going to discuss here today. Estelle is her name, her middle name. Estelle means star, a bright shining light at the highest point on a pyramid or a tree or a solar system, there to remind us to look above our heads and witness the wonder of the sky, like an ocean blue blanket or a glittered canopy, guarding the secrets of other worlds. And like a star, she was born to listen to the whispers of the universe, to gather the constellations and weave them into stories. Ibi, I'd just like to ask you, for some of our viewers who may not have time to read the book or have not yet read the book, what was your initial introduction to Octavia Butler?
Thank you so much, Melaine, for hosting, and thank you so much, Beverly, for that wonderful introduction. So I was a sci-fi head, and not within the context of science fiction books or even movies, within the context of being a Black teenager in New York City who was really into spoken word and really into culture, Black culture, Afrocentricity. So my foundation is really a movement that started, well, probably before I was born, where young Black people were trying to grasp for something otherworldly, something that's beyond our existence in either this body or in this country and on this planet. So I first heard my first science fiction poetry from Saul Williams, a renowned poet, and he is a multi-genre artist right now. And I was in Brooklyn during the late 90s spoken word movement, where a lot of young people were getting on stage and telling poems about being extraterrestrial beings and being larger than life. And there was a sort of movement where we were telling tall tales about ourselves. And it was kind of like Nikki Giovanni's ego tripping. And we took that poem and expanded it to be like we're aliens or we're superheroes. And this was after the first Matrix in 1999. And I was in my late teens, and the Matrix was really a huge thing for us because we saw Black people in the future. Morpheus was really a thing. And we were trying to understand the world within the context of we don't belong here and we are larger than life. And everything was about the matrix. We were in college and college was the matrix. Getting a 9 to 5 was the matrix. So that was sort of like my intellectual foundation. It was part of an aesthetic. And within that world, within that subculture, was a deep fan base for Octavia Butler's novels. Octavia has a fan base now, and there are a lot of social media memes about her and T-shirts that says Octavia tried to tell us. But back then, our favorite book was Wild Seed, and it was just about Black people come from the future, or we've always had science fiction in our culture. So for me, when I found out that she was teaching at a workshop in Seattle, Washington, it's hard to get into. I applied, I got into it. I was one of three Black girls, Black young Black women in that workshop. And she had attended at the same age that I attended. She was 23, 24 when she attended the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Workshop in 1971. And I was 23, going on 24 when I attended in 2001. And we just happened to celebrate our birthday together. And the rest, as they say, is history.
That's really beautiful. I think it's really important that you mentioned that you were one of few Black people, specifically Black women, who attended the workshop, and that you find yourself as a minority in a lot of these science fiction spaces. And it leads me to my next question. I think as Black women, our stories have historically gone unseen, unheard, invisibilized. And I still think that if asked to name 5 Black women authors, that most folks would still have difficulties naming them. I don't think we get to know very much about the private lives of Black women writers. And can you share a bit more about why you were specifically interested in crafting this constellation, this wonderful biography about Octavia Butler, and why sharing the early life or the childhood in particular of Butler was not only relevant, but imperative to sharing the story of this Black woman?
So I got my degree in writing specifically for children and young adults because I have a deep love for speculative fiction. And there is a dearth of speculative fiction featuring Black children written by Black authors. And I wanted to learn the craft and understand the history of those who have written it before, like Virginia Hamilton. So within the framework of writing for children, I absolutely wanted to tell Octavia Butler's story, but her girlhood specifically. Of course, there are Black women writers who pursued their career and won awards and became bestsellers. But what's unique about Octavia Butler was that she wrote her first novel at the age of 10. And it wasn't just that she wrote her first novel. She wrote a novel about magical horses who got their powers from fallen stars. And at the age of 10 in 1957, that is something very remarkable. In children's books, we usually see Black children contending with racism and the civil rights movement in the 1950s. We don't hear about the little Black girls who were thinking about Martians and magical horses. And I'm sure there were plenty others. When I first saw, I think it was Lovecraft Country, there was a little Black girl there who loved comic books and was into science fiction. And of course, that series was set in the 1950s. And when I saw that, I said, that's Octavia Butler. And I'm sure she wasn't the only Black girl who was into pulp magazine, which was what it was called back then. And it was one of the cheapest forms of literature that you could purchase during that time, because you could buy a pulp magazine that was probably a later issue. It wasn't new, for 3 cents. And the newer issues were 10 cents. So usually she would go to a used bookstore and get the older pulp magazines, buy them and read them. So that's part of our literary culture that we don't usually talk about. How did we have access to books? And when we did have access to books, sometimes it wasn't always books, it was magazines, Jet magazines, early versions of Ebony and Essence, even, was all part of our literary foundation.
Can you speak more to how Octavia Butler shifted the literary landscape in terms of the representation of Black girlhood? I know you mentioned we don't get to see Black girls who are interested in Martians, but I'm really in particular thinking about your poems, Heroes, boys' books, and Prize girls' books, and what type of Black women characters or what kind of traits did we see in Butler's book that we probably hadn't seen prior to some of her initial writings?
So, like all writers, when we want to get into an art form, we kind of mimic what we see out in the world, whether it's dance, whether it's poetry, whether it's scholarship. So she was copying what she saw. If she was reading short stories written by white men, and she said it herself, she wrote about drunk white men, middle-aged drunk white men who were trying to figure out their lives. And when she tried to write about women, they were all damsels in distress or looking for the right one. And in trying to practice craft and characterization, she copied what she saw, but this wasn't her true self. This wasn't what she wanted to write about. And by virtue of being a young woman, she thought that romance was something that had to write about. And by virtue of getting into a field, trying to break into a field dominated by white men, she thought she had to write about white men, even as a Black woman. And it took some time to write herself into these stories. Her first novel, Dawn, the cover doesn't feature a Black girl or a Black woman. It is a white woman who's kind of covering an alien. You get the sense that she's in another world. So Octavia Butler's first novels got the run-of-the-mill science fiction covers. And for a long time, people did not think that she was a Black woman, even though she wrote herself into those novels. Usually, when you're the first or you're a pioneer, you get some of the things that you want and you don't get all of the things. And it's usually the people who come after you who break down more walls and break down more walls that you see the full representation. So when she first started writing, it was enough that she was in the science fiction space. It was enough that she was getting paid for her writing. And it was enough that she knew that her character was Black. And the ones who came after her maybe got some Black girls on the cover or maybe became bestsellers. She was never a New York Times bestseller throughout her lifetime, even though she had wanted it and she had written that she wanted to be a bestseller. So when we are pioneers, when we are the first to do something, maybe it's enough that we kick down one door, and we don't, as Audre Lorde says, we don't tear down the whole house because other people still have to come in. And I think that was her journey.
Your last answer made me think of Langston Hughes's idea or discussion of the Negro artist. And I know in the book it mentioned that Octavia Butler did not go to segregated schools. And so her understanding of herself and race was a little different from what a lot of young people who grew up in the Jim Crow era were thinking about in terms of how they perceive themselves. And so I'm thinking, what do you think Octavia Butler considered herself a Black writer or a Black woman writer in particular, especially if she didn't necessarily consider herself racializing her characters? Or do you think that was more secondary to the stories that she wanted to tell?
Well, firstly, she absolutely racialized her characters. The publishing industry didn't racialize her characters on the book covers. So she knew she was always intentionally writing Black women characters as the main characters. So for her, it was just enough to be in that space. Repeat the question for me one more time. There's a second part to your question.
Given that she didn't necessarily see worlds in which Black people made up all of it because she had
Mhm.
experience with white students or students of other races, do you think that Blackness or racializing characters was secondary to the story, or do you think that she would have wanted to racialize her characters and put that she put racializing her characters at the forefront of her writing process?
So, what was secondary in her books was not race, but racism. So, while she had diverse characters, she certainly had diverse characters in the Parable series. Of course, in her first novel, Dawn, and the Lilith Ruth series and Pattern Master series, they were all Black characters, but they were in diverse spaces. So it wasn't about racism, it was about humanity. It was her idea that nothing's new under the sun, but there are new suns. So even Lauren Olamina, who is the main character for Parable of the Talents and Parable of the Sower, her community is filled with diverse people. And the idea is that we have to get along so we don't destroy ourselves. Or we all have to get along so aliens don't take over, so we don't destroy the planet. So within that context, it's not about racism, it is about social hierarchy, the hierarchies that we place on ourselves, that it will end up destroying ourselves, and then other forces take over, because not only are humans hierarchical, but the solar system is hierarchical. And it's like, the sun will destroy us. Environment, the way that we treat our environment will destroy us. So in her purview, racism was minutia. It was the least of it all, right? And by placing Black women within that context, Black women will save us. Literally, in her novels, Black women save the world and form community, build community. And that is outside of the context of racism. If we remove racism out of the equation, the least among us, or the lower rung of society, which I always believe is Black girls or darker skinned girls, will end up leading us if we give them the power to do so.
That is such a wonderful and powerful distinction. Thank you so much for that. I was really interested in your concept of Octavia Butler as a rogue planet. And I resonated with this because I feel often that Black women or Black girl intellectuals spend a lot of time alone in order to hone their skills or their abilities and to study. And I think oftentimes we do become ostracized, or if you're younger, perhaps ridiculed or misunderstood for spending more time with papers or books and ideas rather than with people. And so I think a lot of Black girls who might be considered awkward or weird, like Octavia Butler was growing up, suffer from extreme loneliness at times. And I was wondering if you could speak to why it's important for Black women and girls to nurture their internal life or the life of the mind, and what can come from spending such intimate time with the self or spending time in intense study.
That is an incredible, that is a great question. Thank you for asking that. Uh, I needed to create space in this book to explain how alone and at times lonely she was. I went to the Huntington Library, which was in California, where her papers are housed, and there are dozens and dozens of boxes of her journal entries, photos, notes of her novels there. And in Star Child, it's only I could not use 98% of what I read and what I found, but I read a lot of entries of just being lonely, her being lonely and her struggling with charisma. And I think there's this perception in our society that by virtue of being successful, that we figured out how to work a room, right? Or how to do those soft skills that are very necessary to move up in the world. And that we have a lot of friends, or that we are sociable and just extroverts by virtue of being successful. So in one of her bios, she says she's a hermit if she's not careful and comfortably asocial. And that means that, yes, she went into her head a lot. And as a child, she was very cerebral, which is why Star Child is in verse, because it was hard to explain someone who's very intellectual, explain the life of someone who's very intellectual when she didn't do anything, but she thought about a lot of things. So for me, it was to place her life within the context of what was happening in society. So yes, in order to grow, in order to deepen our understanding of the world, in order to become wise, not just smart, but wise, we have to retreat into our inner lives and in our inner space. There's something happening now where, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, but we put our lives on Front Street through social media. And our activism is also on social media. And as a parent, as someone who's older and did not grow up with social media necessarily, I wonder when people are taking time for themselves to really think about their ideas, to unlearn certain things. It seems like everybody's smart, but then no one is creating something new or being innovative. And that sort of wisdom comes with time and quiet space. I am a huge advocate for like shutting everything down, turning everything off, and learn something new about not just yourself, but about the world and cultivate your ideas. And I hear you're in a PhD program. That's something where it is the life of the mind. And I don't think that everything you're learning about your area of study that you go out and tweet it every second. You still have to practice your ideas. You have to figure them out and hypothesize and do the scientific method or what have you to make sure that what you're saying is actually true. And there is a danger in not taking time for yourself and not thinking about those ideas before you send them out into the world. She was always in her head and was figuring out the world before she wrote her stories and while she's writing her stories. She was a lifelong learner. And in the age of social media, I really want us, Black girls especially, to be lifelong learners and take time to not just nap. I'm a proud member of the nap ministry. To nap, to sleep, to rest, to think, to create, and then to speak in that order.
I completely agree. And I do think study is part of self care. Study the self, study your own consciousness, studying books.
And
I think
read,
that's wonderful.
read and write.
Reading and writing. Yeah, so in this conversation, I'm reminded of Farah Jasmine Griffin's recent work and her idea of reading until you understand. And so I'm thinking about reading and writing as fluid practices of, as you've already said, redoing and undoing, reworking, deconstructing popular ideas of person, place in society that often displaces Black women or Black girls in social spaces. And so I was especially interested in reading or seeing Butler's notebooks and the quotes about her dependence on writing and her relationship to it. And so I was wondering about how she actually how she perceived writing or her writing, and if she might have considered it as a line of flight or a line of escape in creating her own world, and perhaps writing even as a form of fugitivity, especially in thinking about creating worlds for Black people. And so could you speak more into thinking about her relationship, not only to science fiction, but to thinking about writing in an Afrofuturistic style as a form of fugitivity or escape?
I love that phrase, writing as a form of fugitivity. I think that's exactly what she did. And I wrote those poems and told her story within the context of being born after World War II, being a little Black girl, not only during the civil rights movement, but during the space race and McCarthyism. She was not in the deep South. She was in California and within a few miles of Hollywood. And also within this world where people were genuinely concerned about an alien invasion in the 1950s. And she listened to a lot of radio plays. She had the television, it was black and white, but at that time, people listened to a lot of radio drama, probably like true crime podcasts now, right? So the fear there was Russian invasion and Martian invasion. And the civil rights was something that was happening over there. I've seen her write that. Civil rights movement and the bombings and the marches was just away from whatever was happening in LA. We don't usually get those stories of 1950s, 1960s LA. And I was able to see a photograph of her second grade class, a second grade class in their school that she had attended in the elementary school. And it was the most diverse class I have ever seen. My kids, I grew up in New York City. My kids went to school in New York City, and New York City is incredibly segregated. But her class in the late 1950s had Asian and Latinx and Black kids all in one room. And we don't usually see that. So I think for her, she was writing her world. It wasn't necessarily an escape. She was taking the world, her integrated world of 1950s, early 1960s LA, and putting it on the page and combining that with the paranoia of Russian invasion and communism and the civil rights movement. All of that exists in the body of work of Octavia Butler. And by virtue of writing those, she was creating another world. And I don't think she was necessarily escaping it. I think she was documenting. She lived a very secluded and sheltered life. So I think if we do say that she was escaping, it was a way of allowing her imagination to run free. One of the things I have in the book was that she questioned the Bible because her aunts and her mother and her grandmother were staunch Baptists, the sort that didn't wear jewelry or wear pants. And she questioned this idea of God and Jesus. You don't do that in 1950s and the 1960s as a little Black girl, but she did because it didn't make sense within the context of the space race. So for her, she was into science. Because she was into science, she questioned the religion that she was brought up in. So it was less uh, like fugitive writing, as you mentioned, and more documentation.
Wow. I
Great
think,
question.
oh, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for your answer. Um, I think talking about how she grew up in California is really important because I found the School of Child section very special in terms of the way that you acknowledge the way that society perceives, labels, and treats children with different abilities. Um, can you speak more to how Butler being labeled as you wrote slow or having different learning capabilities or having feelings of anxiety affected her, and perhaps a bit more about what we can do as a people to support Black children who navigate time and space differently?
I love that phrase, children who navigate time and space differently, because she certainly did. So because she wasn't on it, whatever Black girlhood looked like in the 1950s, and I'm sure there was a whole lot of sass to go around, she did not have that because she was busy watching the world around her. And they called her, even her family members called her slow and backwards. And teachers remarked on her report card. So this is something she was reflecting on, and it was something that was displayed in her school reports. And for her, for her, she was sensitive about that, and her mother pushed her to not be like that. So one thing in the book was that her mother left school. Her mother was very tall, as was Octavia Butler. And because her mother started school in kindergarten, of course, years before Octavia Butler was born, they thought she was too tall for her age, or they aged her, as the society does with many Black girls, and put her in a third grade class. So her mother at 5 years old was with other 8 year olds. And because she was 8 years old, the school didn't believe that she was actually five. That's what the thing. And you have to understand the time period was for Black people in this country, documentation of their birth, especially if they were born at home without access to birth certificates or what have you. Your age was kind of like the year that you were born was something blurry, or even the date. So the school did not believe that her mother was actually 5 years old because she was a tall child, put her in the third grade, and she could not keep up with the third graders at 5. So her mother was labeled as slow. And Octavia Butler, even as a child, was labeled as slow for very different reasons. She was incredibly shy and had a big imagination. So she couldn't keep up with the schoolwork because she was always daydreaming. So within that context, she's labeled as slow. And we don't get to see Black girlhood in expressed in different ways. It's not a testament to a lack of being intelligent. It is probably differently abled. We don't usually talk about Blackness and neurodivergence or neurodiversity or having a different way of viewing the world. We're not a monolith, and part of that, us not being a monolith, is that we approach education in very different ways. We approach social settings and social dynamics in very different ways. She struggled with charisma as a 50-year-old Black woman. When I first met her, she was incredibly awkward. What does it look like to be 50 something, a tall Black woman, and be awkward and just socially just inept? So that was her throughout her life. And I think we need to talk more about Black nerdhood in that way.
I completely agree. I think that was I to struggle with charisma as a 50 something year old woman. That's something I haven't considered that I think I'm going to have to sit with for a little. But I was really taken by your point on imaginative practice, and I wanted to know more about how one goes about going to the archive, which I think a lot of people they connect the archive with heavy academic research or like a certain type of professional research. And transition from going to the archive and encountering this woman who deserves more attention, despite the fact that she's recently become an even more popular cultural icon, to a children's book. And so I wanted to know if you could share more about how do you break down complex information and sometimes almost confidential information or some type of archives that we really can't make sense of, that is up to a certain scholar to make sense of for us, and then to translate it for children, and maybe what that process was like of imagining yourself in the perspective of a child in the book's development.
Again, that's a great question. So I had to lean on the fact that she was writing about Martians and horses at the age of 10. And I could not just focus on her as a 10-year-old. I had to think about children in general and how society they're influenced by society, and they're also influenced by their family. So her childhood was put within context. And me going into the archives, I was looking for clues into her girlhood. There was postcards, several postcards of her simply listing her possessions. And it's a short list, right? And if we think about children today and you ask them to list their possessions, it's probably unthinkable, unfathomable for them to come up with. But for her, it was a list of 5 things that she valued. And that was a testament to her being an observant child and her being obsessed with list making and documenting time and money from a very early age. She was working as a teenager and she was figuring out her hourly wage and her wanting some basic things and how much her hourly wage how much money she would get per hour to be able to afford a certain thing. And you saw her working that out, that math problem out on index cards. So that was, and I couldn't put that necessarily into the book, but that's her writing process as well. So I had to put that into context. That's for a child to understand that she stuck to it. She never wavered. She might have done different kinds of jobs, but at the age of 10, she knew she wanted to be a writer and did not look away from that goal whatsoever. And one of the ways that she did that was she wrote it down. She knew that there were white men getting $100,000 for books. She wrote that down in the late 1960s and didn't bat an eye. Nowhere in her documents did she ever wonder if it's possible. She said, see to it, so be it, see to it. This will happen. And this is not something that came from her own like ideation. she she listened to a lot of books on tape that were about how to focus the mind, how to get what you want, the sort of like new age stuff that people listen to now. She listened to a lot of self help books to help her train her mind and train her thinking to manifest what she wants. And she started doing that in her late teens. So there was a certain kind of stick to itiveness, a certain kind of unwavering determination to reach her goals. And you saw that in writing. That was all in the archives. And that's a testament to the power of writing things down, I think, to say that you want to do something, you have it down on paper on an index card and to see it manifest over time. So that's what the archives did for me. It let me know what kind of child she was and that she was incredibly determined to achieve her goal.
I think that was part of, I think her manifestation, and to see that is so impressive, especially in light of new age practices today. And I think, especially with my peers and my colleagues, we think that this is something that's new, but I think the power to manifest the future has been undertaken by many people in just different ways. And so I did recently go to the Afrofuturism exhibition in Oakland and see the papers in person, and it was truly astounding. I do want to talk a bit about Afrofuturism, especially as we are discussing this wonderful book you've written about the mother of Afrofuturism. Would you mind explaining a little bit about your definition of Afrofuturism to those who might be new to it, and to talk more about the type of future that Butler imagined for Black people at the time?
So Afrofuturism, in the book I named the person who coined the term, and then there's someone, I think Alondra Nelson, who made it popular. So Afrofuturism is the idea of not just Black people in the future, but how Black people interact with future technologies or even present technologies. It's the way that Black people incorporate future visions, how technology will develop over time into their art, into their writing, into their poetry, into their fashion, into their visual art, into their aesthetics in general. So it is a conversation between our past, our present, and our future, and how we imagine that future to be. So I think it is in every art form, in a lot of art forms. I want to give a nod to author Nnedi Okorafor, whose recent books were the Binti series and Akata Woman, who coined the term, or who really, really claimed the term African futurism. So hers is specific to the African continent, and how African people and African culture, like pre-colonial and outside of colonization, interacts with the future. And Afrofuturism, I think, encompasses Blackness in general. As someone who was born in Haiti, I'm interested in Caribbean futurism, because what does the future look like in a place that's hot and sunny with palm trees, right? So for me, also American-centered Afrofuturism takes into consideration hip hop and maybe jazz. I'm interested in how Sun Ra in 1957, when Octavia Butler was just 10 years old, created space jazz. And he was also influenced by the space race. And he was strange. He infused ancient Egyptian mythology into his music and into his aesthetic. We think about Parliament Funkadelic and how they were also Afrofuturist, while incorporating African mythology, specifically Egyptian mythology, into their personal aesthetic. I think Beyonce's The Lion King, the soundtrack, Black Parade, and even the whole the movie, the video movie where she has the cow horns and the moon, which is the ancient Egyptian goddess, is Afrofuturist. So sometimes it's not just about future; it's about bringing the past into the present as a way to create a future narrative. It is a beautiful concept. And I think Alma Thomas is an artist that worked with it looked like digital painting, but it was actual painting. I just saw an article that she is the godmother of Afrofuturism, also because of how she painted. She didn't paint people, she painted algorithms. That is a fascinating concept as well, in the way that you have 0 and 1, that sort of that's the foundation for computer science or something like that. She was painting that. So that is also Afrofuturism.
Thank you so much.
Twitter is also Afrofuturist. In the way that we engage with that social media platform, I think it's also Afrofuturism. I could go on about this. Thank you for asking that.
No, of course. I study Afro-Surrealism in my program, and I know that they overlap some in terms of Black speculative movements and Black speculative ideology. And I actually wanted to double back to the question about the type of future that Butler saw for Black people, but tied into another question I had about the idea that certain Black speculative ideologies or movements, such as Afrofuturism, are usually considered very lofty. And non-grounded as it pertains to Black people's day-to-day life experiences. And so I wanted to maybe think about outside of literature, although I'm aware that Afrofuturism began as a mostly science fiction and literary field. How can Black people integrate Afrofuturism into some of their daily life experience or Afrofuturistic ideas in a way that helps ground some of these movements for people who may not necessarily be in certain spaces where literature or some of these conversations are more predominant or accessible?
Oh my gosh, yes. This is a form of it. What Black Girls Rock does, in terms of on the social media platforms, it's a multidisciplinary, multi-genre movement that centers Black girlhood. That is a form of grounding Afrofuturism, where it's not just the stage, it's not just a show, it is a book club, it is, with all the followers on Instagram, it is something that makes use of social media and technologies to create a movement that centers, not just Black women performers, but Black girls and thought and ideas, and a book club, just partnering with other things. There's also Well Read Black Girl, where a literary movement is brought online and to a podcast. It is interacting with the technologies that are meant to exploit it, but we exploit us, but we exploit it for our use. I mentioned Black Twitter before. That's another way of spreading ideas and movements through our wit and our humor. What we do with memes and TikTok is groundbreaking. It is our creativity put out on Front Street. Something that doesn't involve social media would be even how we dress, even how we put ourselves together, what we do with our hair, the new things like products and the chemicals that go into products, and somebody saying 4A and 4C and 4, that is bringing science into our existence. I think it is truly phenomenal and groundbreaking that we have made our hair into a science that we can understand. Because there was like a documentary called, just the title alone, the title was 400 Years Without a Comb. And if we take into consideration slavery and the fact that we did not have the time nor the wherewithal to care for our hair, now we have science. Now we have ways of altering our looks, adding and taking away, and the number of products. It's a movement, and it is Afrofuturistic because it's not just that we exist, we understand the science behind our existence. And we push back against, like, maybe chemicals that were not good for us. Maybe we have ways of just altering our look with added hair and added color and all of that. It's so beautiful. And I think we already do that. We don't need a guidebook, because I think as part of adapting and survival, as part of survival, we adapt. We adapt to these technologies, and we're still here. And there's something called the singularity, where it says that there's going to be a point, and it's a science fiction idea, there will be a point where technology surpasses technological advancement surpasses human advancement. Like the idea of Philip K. Dick's iRobot, like our machines will have emotions and intelligence. And I don't think that is true for Black people. I think our ingenuity, just the way that we interact with the planet and culture and other human beings, technology will not surpass us. I think we will always be one step ahead because of our creativity. I said a lot.
If I could get that quote put on a vinyl, that technology would not surpass Black people. I love that so much. I'm with it. I also wanted to read one of my favorite poems, which I think helps to ground, not only to return just to Octavia Butler, but also to ground this idea of Afrofuturism as it pertains to Black people and specifically Black girls in Star Child. My favorite poem in your book is Brown Girl from Earth. And for some of the viewers who have the book with them, it would be on page 73. And I'll just read it now.
Okay.
Earth is the world she knows, so close to the sun, this planet that holds her out there in the great beyond. Earthling, maybe she looks out with her telescope, curious creature she is. She wants the universe, so she dreams big, tall, brown-skinned, ancestor-caped, demanding and commanding girl. She wants the universe. The third planet has lost its creators, a place full of brown girls now, demanding and commanding. Imaginative race of people come to shape the world, our innovators, our own storytellers. I absolutely adore that poem. I read it several times when I first encountered it, and I wanted to follow up on your phrase, stick-to-itiveness. I think according to the constellation, the biography, Octavia definitely went through a lot of rejection in her initial storytelling, a lot of critique from teachers, from parents, from community members who were either not interested in her as a person or not interested in her work. And I was wondering what you would say to the little girls out there who are interested in dreaming up new worlds, but who might be afraid of that rejection or afraid to take risks or just riddled with fear based on what other people are telling them to do.
So I want to avoid the cliches, but it is sort of cliche to say walk through it, walk through that feeling, walk through that rejection, not to move around it, but just feel it because it is fuel. I got published late in life, but I was always writing. I never stopped. And I was the sort of imaginative child. And I met Octavia Butler. We share the same birthday. And I got rejections because as a Haitian, I was not supposed to be into speculative fiction. I'm supposed to write about being a sad immigrant. And that was my first novel for me to get through the door. So, in that sense, I walked through the rejection, and it's not just about stick-to-itiveness, it is about patience. It is about envisioning yourself on the other side and walking through whatever trials and tribulations come your way to actually be on the other side. So for anyone struggling with that sort of rejection, and it could be a rejection of who you are and how you see yourself in the world, it is to like stay for another day. Another day may be another rejection, or it might be the acceptance of small parts of yourself. Each day, small parts of yourself, tiny doors open to let you in. For Octavia, it was tiny door after tiny door after tiny door until she became a MacArthur Genius Fellow. One of the, not very few Black women have gotten that, but the first within the science fiction genre. And she did not become a New York Times bestseller until after her death, but she sold a lot of books, and people were like holding her up and just really seeing her worth by the time she had passed away. And that took years and years and years.
Wow, thank you so much. And I also wanted to know, in creating this book, was there a particular child that you were writing to or for? And if so, who is the child that you're writing to?
I was writing for myself. Sometimes you gotta really you write for yourself first and foremost. This is something I would have wanted to read. I was an incredibly awkward child. I don't I didn't fit like the cool aesthetic, and it was a testament to saying like be who you are regardless. Even with my big age, I struggle with fitting in sometimes. And social media makes it worse because I'm like, am I doing enough to promote myself? Now, like you think about capitalism and stuff, it's not enough that you post a photo, you got to do like a video production or something like that, where in order to be seen, you have to do a little extra. And I had to think about, well, how do I want to be seen now? You know, will people see me? And I'm so grateful for this opportunity too, because of course I know about Black Girls Rock. And I'm like, hey, I didn't have to do a whole song and dance to get here. You create the thing that people want, and you decide whether it is you that want to be out in the world or your art. So I made the decision that I want my art to have legs. So I don't have to do all the dancing, all the tap dancing. So I wrote that for myself because Octavia struggled with charisma. She didn't think she had the look. She would go to writing events and be incredibly shy and kind of retreat into the background. So it wasn't her as the author who became a celebrity figure, right? In the way that her white male counterparts would work a room. Her books surpassed their books without her having to work the room, without her having charisma. And it's for those Black women or women in general who don't do that. And you don't have to do that to be a leader. You don't have to do that for people to listen to you. You create something that inspires people, and you don't have to be like the Oz, right? The Wizard of Oz. Remember that, the short guy behind the curtain. So I feel like be the nerd that you are and let your art speak for yourself. Let your work speak for itself. And that is the thing that will go out and reach other people. And if it's you as a celebrity figure, if that's your thing, by all means. So ultimately, I wrote that for little nerds everywhere.
Evie, thank you so very much for this conversation. I just have one last quick question. What are you working on next? How can we follow you?
Oh, wow. Well, I'm on social media at ibizoboi.com. Not as much, right? I write a lot of books. My next book, it comes out next winter. It's called Nigeria Jones. I love this book so much. It's about a girl contending with the American Constitution, US history, and the Black and Indigenous girls who helped shape the founding fathers, whose relationships, the fraught relationships with the founding fathers, helped shape this country. So I'm looking forward to sharing that with readers everywhere.
All right.
Oh, and Foyer to the People. Oh, I'm sorry. Comes out next week. This is a Black Panther. Where is it? Where's my okay? A Black Panther novel featuring Okoye of the Dora Milaje. And it comes out next week. She's my girl, right? And she's a teenager in this book who helps some teens in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Brownsville. Brownsville doesn't get played. I lived in Brownsville, and we need to just uplift those communities where our people live and are still struggling with marginalization and gentrification and stuff like that. Thank you so much, Melaine. Those were such great questions. I really appreciated them.
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us. And I would just like to throw it back to Beverly Bond.
Thank you, Melaine. Thank you, Ibi. I enjoyed this conversation so much, and it's so exciting to be able to present this book club every month, to see all of the incredible authors who are out here, all the incredible Black women who are really game changers, and also to highlight the BGR alum like Melaine who are shot callers, like growing into it's such an incredible moment for me, as a mentor to watch our girls continue to grow into these awesome beings who are changing the world and making so many things happen. And I'm just so proud. It just always makes me so happy every time I'm here. So thank you, Melaine. Thank you, Ibi. I can't wait to read this book, and I hope you all will go out and get this book. I think the one thing we did not mention is where, I know it's everywhere books are sold, but was there a particular bookstore that you wanted to share, Ibi, where they could purchase the book?
Of course, I please support Black-owned bookstores,
Mhm.
Mahogany Books in DC, Harriet's Bookshop in Philadelphia, Sankofa Books in DC, Brave and Kind Books in Atlanta. I could go on, but for the most part, please support your local independent books and Black bookstores whenever you can.
I love it. Thank you so much. And again, you're joining us at the BGR Book Club. Next month, we will be featuring a book by Melinda Hart, and it's called You Are More Than Magic. For more information about Black Girls Rock, of course, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all under Black Girls Rock. Use the hashtag Black Girls Rock and Black Girls Lead. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We will be re-airing this on our YouTube channel, so stay tuned for that as well. And thank you.